For each of the last 2 years, I would make one of my most popular videos called My Most and Least Profitable Flowers of the Season. And this year, I sat down to crunch the numbers to attempt to do the same video when I realized, hey, these flowers look a little bit different. Some of them were completely new flowers that I never grew before, but many were flowers that either made it to the bottom of the list in year one, but now were among my more profitable ones, or vice versa. And that made me stop and pause to think, is this the right question to ask if I'm looking at judging which flowers I should grow again or more of from a business standpoint? It made me realize that I should be looking at the data a little bit differently. So that's exactly what we're going to be talking about. In fact, we're going to be going through the list of about 20 varieties that I grew this year and categorizing them into certain buckets that hopefully will help you understand what can make a flower valuable based off of what you are trying to do. Because if there's anything that I learned this year, it's that you can practically make any crop profitable, assuming that you are able to grow that crop well and assuming that you can find a market for that crop. Then it becomes a matter of how do you use that crop in something like a mixed bouquet and how are you pricing it. So for those of you who are new to my channel, my name is Jessie. I have just wrapped up my 3rd year of flower farming. This year I grew about 35 total types of flowers. I sold about 20 types wholesale, and I grow on a relatively small space. I grow in a 40 by 90 foot space, supplemented by a small basement where I do winter tulips. And we're going to talk about tulips because they're my biggest crop, but I wanted to give you some perspective. I do not have a big space to grow. I have a bigger space than an average backyard, but I'm still very, very small. So obviously I need to think about how do I get the most out of my space while farming sustainably and while also practicing things that are going to make my life easier, make the business a little bit more profitable, like putting in perennials. I have very high deer pressure, so there are very few crops that I can put outside of this 40 by 90 foot space. So we are going to go through this list of flowers. We're actually going to go through my top 10 and you'll see where they land. If you want more details, I had published a very, very detailed Patreon article looking at this from the wholesale lens and looking at it through the 20 flowers, the top 20 flowers that I sold wholesale, as well as how much I sold bunches. You'll get a lot more of the details. My goal with my Patreon is to provide far more value than the price that it costs, which is $5 a month. It's for all of those nerds out there who really, really want to get into the details. So I have 5 buckets of flowers or categories that I ended up putting flowers into to describe how they behave from a business standpoint. So I'm talking about this from the perspective of someone who not only sold wholesale, but also sold retail. And I'm hoping that what I'm saying will be relatable no matter which sales channel you're selling at, assuming you're not selling 100% wholesale. Because if you're selling 100% wholesale, the dynamics become a little bit different. And I say this because when you're selling wholesale, you don't need to think about what are some of the other things I need to grow in order to make an adequate bouquet that's going to have perceived value and sell and have a long vase life. Those are all little things that we need to be thinking about when we are crop planning and thinking about how to maximize the business potential of what we are trying to grow. All right, so the first bucket is high cost flowers that need scale. Second is initial high cost flowers that perennialize or will come back again. The third one is low cost workhorses that have a large market. Fourth one is excellent team player. And the fifth one is Profitability All Stars. All right, so we're gonna dive into each of these in detail. So let's start first with the first category, which is high cost flowers that need scale in order to drive profitability. And this category, I'm thinking primarily of just a few flowers. These are typically bulbs that don't perennialize. They could be patented types of varieties. So think about like a scoop scabiosa, some of the ranunculus corms that are really, really expensive, where if you're not growing well, you may not be able to get enough stems out of them. So their success here really hinges on your ability to tightly control your labor costs to obtain bulk purchasing in the form of wholesale pricing. And last but not least, your ability to sell them consistently at a certain price threshold. So this is the one type of crop that you absolutely need to make sure that you're looking at the revenue and you're looking at the cost, right? Because these are the two main inputs to get to profit. You need to make sure that you are making the revenue number at least at a minimum that allows you to make a profit. So you're trying to maximize that number. And the cost side, you're trying to get as low as possible. So a concrete example here is tulips. Tulips for me. Tulips are my biggest crop. And for a lot of people, tulips are not profitable. So I think that tulips are not as profitable for many people. One, because they're not either growing enough, or two, they're not controlling for the revenue side. And then three, I think realistically, some people are spending a little too much time on cleaning field tulips. But I think the first two are the most relevant for my discussion point over here. So let's actually take an example and dive a little bit into the numbers of tulips. I think that for the most part, if you have a wholesale license, or meaning you have a business account you can buy through wholesale, you're able to get bulbs somewhere in like the high 20 cents to maybe even like high 50, low 60 cent places, right? So the 20 cent tulips are going to get you your typical single types, nothing wrong with them. But then when you get to like the 50 cent range, you're getting into like fringe doubles, like some really, really cool specialty types of tulips that people are definitely not going to see unless they go to a specialty tulip farmer. All right, so you've got a range of bulbs here, and we haven't even included freight. And once you include the cost of labor, that cost of a bulb now is going to go up anywhere by like 10 to 20 cents, depending on how efficient you are. So I typically use like about 50 cents for cost of bulb as an average. That even includes my labor. And if it's a really, really specialty tulip, we're talking about like 65, 70 cents. So again, like I have done time studies on my hydroponic and my field tulips. So for those of you who are my Patreon members, I actually have an article on that. And I found that my field tulips, if I did the no dig on steroids method, which I have a video here talking about that, I spent significantly less time on labor, that it actually made those field tulips profitable. But it also taught me that the baseline for which I could sell my tulip stems at was a little bit different for each. So for example, because I had been able to reduce my labor costs on field tulips, I was able to go down to $1.75 per stem selling them in order to make some sort of profit that I was happy with. Now, field tulips and winter tulips are also coming in at different times. I would say that it's easier to price winter tulips more at a premium where I am, because no one else is growing anything around here. So I'm typically charging upwards of $2 per stem wholesale for my winter tulips. All right, so let's now do a simple math equation, right? So let's say for field grown tulips, I'm selling a stem at $1.75. My cost is around 50 cents. The total profit per stem is $1.25, which I would say is pretty decent and adequate. And I would say that when you hear the rest of this video and see how profitable some of the other flowers are, you're going to start saying to yourself, okay, actually tulips, $1.25 sounds good, but it's actually not the most profitable. And that's true, right? So this is why I'm talking about growing them at scale. So if you grew 100 tulips, your total profit is $125. If you grew 1,000 tulips, now your profit is $1,025, right? So obviously the more you grow, the more in absolute dollar amounts it's going to grow up. Tulips are one of those great crops to scale because you can just dump a full crate into a trench. You don't have to lay them up meticulously bulb by bulb. So your labor costs can be really reduced. Once they're in the ground, assuming they're watered, there's usually no weeding because tulips are resting over winter. They're one of the first to grow in the spring. And then assuming you can manage your labor costs of pulling them and cleaning them, they can actually be a very quick crop. You just have to make sure you have the market for them. So if you're able to grow a lot, you can make a lot of money at once versus relying on another crop such as like a zinnia, where you're probably not going to make the same amount of money on zinnias in the same amount of time as tulips because they are a much longer crop. People don't really go crazy for zinnias like they do for tulips. So your window of opportunity is extended for zinnias traded off by the fact that there's probably going to be lower demand, right? So if you're getting what I'm saying that there are certain crops where you can maximize the short period of demand for them, as well as the ability to bulk plant and do a lot of cost control in that category. All right, so enough about tulips here, but I was mentioning there are some other things that could fit in here. So for example, like I grew scoop scabiosa. And I think that my failure with scoop scabiosa this year was the fact that when I got them into the ground, something pulled out half of them, and the other half that didn't get pulled out really got nibbled on and never fully recovered. So my productivity wasn't great. Scoop scabiosa is a patented variety. It's supposed to be highly, highly productive. My problem was that the flowers that came out of them, the bloom heads weren't big enough to even look like focals. They look like accent flowers at best, and I didn't get great productivity out of them. That's also another great flower where you definitely want to make sure you're planting them at scale. You probably don't want to just buy like 1 or 2 plants and buy them at a really, really high premium. You want to make sure that you are trying to maximize buying a full tray if possible. And that is a principle for anyone who has the space to try to buy in trays or to try to maximize the space in a full row, especially if you are netting, because you are spending the same amount of time netting a particular spot, or even if you're doing half a row versus a full row, the amount of time you're getting stakes up and getting the netting out, you might as well do as much as the row as you can. So therefore you want to try to buy in full trays if possible, or split trays with someone. All right, so next bucket here is initial high cost flowers that perennialize, meaning that you're outlaying a lot of money up front, or seemingly a lot of money up front, and you may not get all of the returns in year 1, but you will get the returns back in year 2 and onwards. So there are a few examples of crops that fit into this category for me. Lilies, sea holly, dahlias, and callas are the top 4. I'm going to spend some time actually talking about sea holly as well as callas. So sea hollies in the grand scheme compared to something that is started from a bulb is not that much money to start from seed. Now, if you were to buy sea holly from plugs, you're going to find that sea holly comes at a high premium for plugs. And again, it's because they are a perennial. So out of all of the plugs that I bought from a local grower, to overwinter, sea holly was definitely by far the most expensive, and by multiples. But they are also now one of the few crops that are in the ground for year 3 versus all of the other ones that were either annuals or they could have perennialized but just weren't worth the space, right? So sea holly in this case became a really profitable crop for me because in year 2, I sold like $600 worth just wholesale. And really the only cost attached to that was the labor of harvesting it, because sea holly is really easy to maintain. There is a bit of weeding and there's a bit of maintenance to make sure that you don't want the ones that you haven't picked to go to seed and reseed, because once you have some sea holly, you don't need more sea holly. So there's a little bit of labor on that side, but for the most part, it fetches a pretty high dollar price point, because if you can grow sea holly tall and well, it is really big, it's really bushy, and especially if you're going to sell wholesale, sometimes greenery, especially when it gets really big, is difficult to ship, or if they can ship it, it's unreliable to ship because it might come damaged to the florist. So sea holly is actually one of those crops that's a little bit easier to ship, but I find that it has a really long bloom time window. You can harvest it when there's more green than blue. You can harvest it when it's fully blue, and it gives you a lot of versatility and buffer in that regard. So sea holly has now stayed in my field for that purpose. Even though I'm not going to be selling as much wholesale next year, I find that if you pinch the central stem, you can get a lot shorter stems that are going to be really good in your mixed bouquets. Next, let's talk about one of my favorite new flowers that I grew this year, which is callas. So callas, for those of you who don't know, are grown from rhizomes. They kind of look like ginger, and these rhizomes can be pretty expensive. Now, the thing with callas is that they are actually really easy to ship. They last for a really, really long time. So you may not think that there's a market for callas, but let me tell you, there's so many different colors of callas out there. And if you get florists who do event work and want to source local, there is definitely a market for callas. I had a bit of mistimed callas, but basically nearly every single stem I sold, I was able to sell wholesale or retail. And they do so well in retail bouquet because, again, they last forever. In fact, I gave one of my CSA customers a bonus bouquet, and it was mostly full of callas, and she still has them after a month and a half. So that's just to illustrate how robust they are. But callas, if you get a big enough rhizome, you can get a lot of stems off of them. So I, in year one, didn't fully know how to grow callas. I wasn't great at growing them, but I started understanding towards the end how to grow a good calla, how to get long stems. Again, Patreon members, there's a full article on whether or not you should grow callas and my tips and tricks for growing them if you're interested. But anyway, my problem with callas is that they can perennialize in my zone, but they're like dahlias in the sense that they're not going to perennialize in my frigid winter weather, which means I need to dig them up and bring them inside. The next part about this is I've heard from other people that callas in year two are just not as productive. And when I was at the ASCFG conference this year, Co-Claver from Zabo Plants, who sells callas, I actually got my callas from them, said that they spray gibberellic acid on these rhizomes, and that it's basically almost like it encourages them to be more productive. So I have a feeling that if you want these callas to be as productive in year two as they were in year one, you have to spray this acid on them. And I started looking into this, and it, like, a little amount goes a really long way. But the point is, because of our personal situation, what's been going on with my daughter, I did not dig up the rhizomes. Heck, I didn't even bring the crates of callas back inside. I'm just going to see how they're doing, and I'm not going to spray them with the gibberellic acid. So I say this because great crop, great flower. I would totally grow them again if I was seriously flower farming at a higher level and at a higher volume. But I don't think I'm going to be growing them again next year, because this is the type of flower that you need to grow excellently, and then you also need to make sure that you can get another use out of these rhizomes. Now, I do know a local flower farmer who grows callas and treats those rhizomes as annuals, and they just charge a much higher price point for these callas in their bouquets. They're able to do it because they're selling in New York City. But again, like, there are ways to fudge this just where I am and how I price my bouquets. I just wouldn't be able to make callas work if I don't perennialize those rhizomes. I said I was just going to talk about two flowers, but let's quickly touch upon dahlias. This year, I went down this concept of I'm just going to plant my favorite dahlias that I know do well wholesale and retail. So I focused actually specifically on the ball types. There was only one non-ball type that I grew, which is called Westerton Lillian. It's my favorite dahlia. I'd actually promised a fellow flower farmer that I was going to get her tubers, but in the spring when I was planting my tubers, I didn't see many eyes on many of them, so therefore I wanted to multiply my stock again. So my strategy with dahlias has been plant my favorite, multiply the tuber stock, and then plant more of them over time so that I can have a massive amount of dahlias. And again, if you are buying an expensive tuber, so we'll call it like $20 for a single tuber because you are buying from a small farm that is going to decrease your chances of getting something like crown gall, you want to make sure that you are able to multiply the stock of those tubers to be able to get more tubers to make this a truly profitable crop. Now, dahlias are one of those crops where you might be able to get away from buying a single tuber that's $20, have a very overly productive dahlia in year one, charge the sufficient amount per stem, which is usually around, I would say, like $2.50 to $3 wholesale and $4 to $5 to $6 per stem retail in a bouquet to get that money back. But again, that's always not guaranteed, which is why you want to make sure you can save those tubers. Third category, which is one of my favorites this year. I think this one is going to be one that many of you will find flowers that fit in here. These are low-cost workhorses that have a large market, and I am defining these as they are either multi-stemmed, they could be cut and come again, and if they are perennial bonus points, especially if they can be started by seed. All right, so few flowers that fall into here from my list are cosmos, marigolds, zinnias, bells of Ireland, celosia. There's a lot more that fit into here, but I want to talk about a couple of these flowers. So cosmos. Cosmos are the one flower that I wrote off in year one, And I just didn't understand how to properly use Cosmos and that there was a great wholesale market for them. So enter year 2 when I went to my co-op and I saw people growing these amazing Cosmos, all these different types of Cosmos, and realized I should be growing Cosmos in year 3, which is what I did. So great example of a low-cost workhorse because seed is really, really cheap. Not only is it cheap, one of those seeds that you should be direct seeding, germinates really, really quickly, time to maturity is really short, and if you grow them well, you are going to have multiple stems coming up at the same time. You can cut them, they'll cut and come back, they'll come back again. So like definition of a workhorse. Has a large market, especially when selling wholesale to event florists, right? So that's the caveat there, especially when selling wholesale to event florists. If you're only doing retail, I still think there's a place for Cosmos, just not as many Cosmos. This category is different from the first category, which was you need scale in order to achieve profitability. This category, you can achieve profitability at a smaller scale, and the intent is that you're going to have multiple of these flowers that are going to get you to a higher absolute dollar profitability. You also don't want to grow so many that you run out of a market to sell. So there's a higher risk of growing too many Cosmos if you're just selling retail, because although you could sell Cosmos in single bunches, I've seen it happen, a lot of people are going to be unwilling to do that because they don't have a great vase life, right? But Cosmos have a place in a bouquet because they provide extra air, this like whimsicalness, and just like this extra feel to a bouquet that would not exist if the Cosmo weren't in there. Now, I said earlier that you want to be careful about not having too many of these types of ingredients growing at once if you're just making mixed bouquets. So a good example is in the spring, there are 2 Cosmo-like flowers. They're like, we call them like floaties. You would have something like saponaria and corncockle. And saponaria typically blooms a little bit earlier than corncockle. So you could argue that if you really want consistent bouquets throughout the year, you need both of them. But let's just say that you are selling, I don't know, like a dozen or 2 bouquets a week. You don't have a lot of space, right? So even though they might be blooming at slightly different time frames, they're in the ground mostly at the same time, right? Like 80% of the time they're in the ground at the same time. Corncockle, saponaria both give that whimsical airiness. You don't need 2 of them in a bouquet. You only need 1. And this is one of those places where I would just pick, like, which one do you want, right? They both have their merits. They both have their cons. So just pick one that you really like. But I wouldn't waste precious space for both of them unless, if again, you are selling wholesale, because there is definitely separate demand for corncockle and saponaria. So corncockle is agrostemma, for those of you who don't know. Another flower that I grew this year that was new was Bells of Ireland. Bells of Ireland is a great workhorse because it is multi-stem. It's not necessarily cut and come again because you don't have enough time for that second flush to come before it gets too hot in the summer, but you can leave it in the ground and you might be able to get a second flush in the fall. Bells of Ireland just are really, really great because they do well retail as well as wholesale. So I found that wholesale, if you grow really, really nice bells, they really stand out against bells that you buy from the wholesaler. Like there's just something different about them and they smell so good. So a crop that is already in the ground, I'm actually going to overwinter them to see if I can get an even better crop for next year. And the last one I want to talk about here is actually celosia. So celosia, I think, is a great workhorse as a whole. And there's so many different types of celosia out there that if you're only just growing one type, you're limiting yourself. And for the last couple of years, I really only grown like 3 celosias. I've grown flamingo feather, ruby parfait, and celosia selway. I put in a tray of celosia selway that I got, and that selway has just continued to reseed. My flamingo feather has also continued to reseed. Flamingo feather I find a little bit more valuable than selway. Selway just doesn't have as robust of a market for wholesale. Like you can sell it wholesale, but it's not as great as some of the coxcomb ones or like the more specialty types that you can get out there, the plume types even. So every single year I'm like, I want less selway, but they keep on reseeding. And so it's a workhorse in that way, right? But at the same time, I just think that there's a lot more potential for me in my field with different types of celosia. So I actually planted some floret ones, and I'm really hoping that those will reseed and get me a lot more, because those are the ones that I really want to be able to use in bouquets. Next one is excellent team player. And what do I mean by that? It means that it serves a very specific and necessary function in a bouquet. So you're going to find that some of the flowers I just talked about in the last category can very well fit into this category. Again, like cosmos, celosia, but I would say that other flowers that I grew that also fit in here were ageratum, amaranth, sweet william, stock, statice, and most fillers would also fit into this category. So let's actually start with fillers. I have a ton of mountain mint outside. I put in I think it was close to 300 mountain mint babies, and I had way more mountain mint than I needed, because when a flower is in excellent team player category, it means that there is not enough of a market to demand high quantities of them. And typically when people want high quantities of these, it would be in something like a one-off event, or you're making a lot of mixed bouquets and there's a lot of demand for the mixed bouquets and not necessarily for this one flower. So filler, right? Are my mountain mint. A lot of my mountain mint actually got cut and put into compost. I sold quite a bit of my mountain mint, but not enough. Now, I can't live without my mountain mint because they are very integral to my spring bouquets. They not only fill up a spring bouquet, they not only bulk it up and give it perceived value, but they allow me to use less, more valuable stems in its place, right? So it may not be profitable on its own, but it makes the bouquet more profitable, right? So that was one of the things that I came to this realization around, which is I think this exercise of figuring out how much did I sell per flower and how much was the cost per flower is a really important exercise just for you to get a handle around those numbers. But you need to be looking at the bigger picture, and you can't be penny wise, pound foolish, in the sense that you care more about how much a holistic bouquet made you than the single stem, because at the end of the day, your business is driven by mixed bouquets and not just by a singular stem, unless if you're selling straight bunches, right? Which possible, but probably not probable for most of us out there for all the flowers that we grow. All right, so another great example here is ageratum. I grew a full tray of ageratum, which is over 200. I can tell you 200 is way too many for someone like me. The ageratum also peaked its blooms at not a great time for me. So it was literally a few weeks after we started treatment for my daughter. She was getting chemotherapy. And at that point, I had just really deprioritized selling through the cooperative. I was selling primarily through this local country store, which I wasn't selling a ton of bouquets of, right? So I even got a local flower farmer to say hey, come, cut for free, cut whatever you want. And she would cut the ageratum. And I would say, did you cut anything? Because it still looks like there's basically 100% out there. So that just goes to tell you how great of a workhorse it is. I was finding on average, each plant was giving me 6 to 8 stems. So nuts. But again, ageratum on its own is not a very valuable crop. I would say the only other crop that I grew that was less valuable than ageratum was statice, right? So it kind of fits into a similar category as statice. By itself, you're not going to fetch a ton for ageratum, but in a bouquet, it definitely has a space where it provides a burst of a blue violet that's typically hard to find that time of year. And not to mention the fact that if you just throw in 3 stems of ageratum, you've now avoided using potentially more costly stems, such as a dahlia or even a zinnia, right? Ageratum by itself is not only easy to grow, prolific, but also relatively low maintenance compared to some other crops that might also be flowering at that time. And also, by the way, ageratum has a really long bloom time window. You can succession plant them. So it's not like a tulip where it comes in 3 weeks and then you're done. There's no more extra time like bells of Ireland to get a second flush. For ageratum, if you plant it early enough, you can actually get quite a productive crop out of that. So I mentioned statice before too, right? Statice, I think, is actually a really great crop to grow, especially if you are doing mixed bouquets. You want something that gives you a little bit more flexibility. I love flowers that can can last for a long time in a vase, but also give me a little bit more flexibility in terms of harvest window. Find a lot of fillers to be also in that category too. But Status also did somewhat decently at my cooperative. Now, again, this is not a crop that I would grow like a full row of for wholesale because Status is pretty easy to fly in, but sometimes there's certain colors that you can't get at the wholesaler. And for me, no other grower was really growing that much Status. So when I grew it, I was able to sell it. I think if I grew like 10 times the amount that I grew, there's no way I could have sold that much Status because it's just not one of those flowers in high demand, right? So again, to be in this category, it's just like you are a great team player in a bouquet, but there is a limited market potential for growing too much of this flower because there's just not enough demand for this one type of flower. So last bucket here is kind of this bucket that I had to create because there were definitely flowers that fit in here, and they weren't necessarily flowers that I grew, but I knew that many people might be growing them and that they are definitely worthwhile to consider. So these, I call them Profitability All Stars. Low cost, high intensity, so meaning like per square foot, you can cram a lot into an area, and high demand. And that could be either high demand through retail or wholesale. So to me, 3 flowers are top of mind: sunflowers, snapdragons, and yarrow. So I'm not gonna say too much about yarrow because I have done so many videos on yarrow. I love yarrow, but it totally fits into this category. Low cost to start from seed or even from plug, very, very high intensity, especially once they perennialize, and very high demand for me, both retail and wholesale. But let's actually talk a little bit about sunflowers. I didn't grow many sunflowers this year. I probably grew like a couple dozen at most because they're not necessarily the most high demand wholesale, but they are very, very high demand retail. So something I would totally consider if you focus on a lot of mixed bouquets, especially like out of a farm stand or at a grocery store. Sunflowers, so many different types of varieties, you should totally be growing them because they are low cost in seed. You can fit a lot into a square foot. Not only can you fit a lot, they are low days to maturity, which means you can flip that field to either grow more sunflowers or something else. And a bonus that I love about sunflowers is that they are really, really deep rooted. So if you live in a place where there's drought or whatever, they are more likely to survive weather extremes because they have that taproot and they're also going deeper into the soil versus most other more shallow rooted plants and getting the nutrients out. So I always say if you have the space, you've grown the sunflowers, like just till them back into the ground if you till, or if you don't till, like I like to leave the roots in the ground and I like to then compost the stems and then put on top of the field again because again, it's reusing all of what you already have instead of fertilizer. And then the second flower on, or the third flower on here is snapdragons. I don't grow a ton of snapdragons because of my issues with thrips, but snapdragons are that one crop that I repeatedly see through established flower farmers as the most profitable flower because they can be grown so closely together. So you can typically fit like 2 to 3 in a Hortanova net, and they typically fetch a pretty decent price point for both retail and wholesale. Now that we've gone through all of that, I want to show you my top 11 flowers that I was able to sell from a wholesale perspective, right? So these are sales, or these are flowers that are categorized by sales for wholesale and not necessarily retail. But I find that for the most part, if I sold a lot of it wholesale, I also sold a lot of it retail because it meant I grew a lot of it. So this is what it looked like. And I put color on top of it because I wanted to see how many fit into each of the buckets that I just talked of and whether there were more of a certain type in a bucket, right? So you can see that 2 colors really stand out, the initial high cost flowers that perennialize, as well as low cost workhorses that have a market. And I think that that is pretty common sense, right? We're talking about flowers that are really productive, that might come again. So that makes it easier for me to grow those plus other flowers that are gonna dedicate more of my labor time, right? So in other words, if you have flowers in the field that are perennializing, that are going to get you stems with very little work that allows you to allocate the time you would have spent growing annuals to growing more annuals, right? And now you have the addition of those perennials. So that's why this list looks so different for me in year 3 versus even in year 2, because I didn't have flowers that perennialized. In fact, in year 2, I would say that I was still growing mostly annuals, and at best I had flowers that were overwintering and preparing to perennialize after their first year. So I would say that in totality, I had a pretty good season. I had tried to quantify the amount of stems that I grew, and if I had to estimate, I grew about 85,000 stems total. And I think that if I really were to push the production in the field, I could probably almost double that amount. I have very generous walkways. Parts of the field were kind of just like closed off because I felt too overwhelmed in year 2 with weeding. Year 3, weed pressure was a lot better because I was able to be on top of those pathways, especially in the early spring. And then there were a couple of areas where I just did not flip those beds because I had perennials in them, right? And then I also grew some vegetables, not a ton, but there was definitely a decent amount of space taken up for vegetables. So I think to produce that amount of stems is still pretty good, and it gives you an idea of what a relatively small space could generate. So that was a lot of information. I know that many of you might have questions, so let me know in the comments below if you have questions. Let me know if you have any thoughts about the categories that I have, where your most profitable and least profitable flowers fit into these categories. And I just love to hear from you in terms of your experience, because I don't grow all the flowers. I would love to experiment growing more flowers next year. And I would love to know which types of flowers I should be growing based off of your experiences. So that's it. And now for a quick update on E. You're okay. Keep going. You got it. See?